In 1994, we had a change of political power. What happened with the economic power?
We didn't invest enough in the infrastructure, the housing. The infrastructure that we inherited was for the white minority. Land redistribution. Our land redistribution program is very thoroughly disappointing. Those, maybe in the DA who don't want redistribution, have to come to terms with the reality of this country. Your financial system will go into collapse. It'll become eaten up by the inflation.
Welcome back to Palatable Politics, a show where we take the complexity out of politics and make it palatable for you. With me, your host, TJ Masilela. Welcome to the show. In today's session, we're going to be going into economics, breaking it down and trying to make all of this interest rate, inflation rate, make it palatable for you. Here to give us insight is a Wits lecturer who has his PhD in economics and also served on the advisory council to the president, Dr. Kenneth Creamer. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks very much for inviting me to your show.
Pleasure to have you. Can you give us a bit of a background as to who you are and what made you decide to become a doctor in economics and all the 1,000 other things, law, finance, etc.?
Well, I finished high school in Johannesburg in 1987 and then went to Wits University in 1988. It was a really tumultuous time in this country, you can imagine. And I remember sitting in the library in my first week, the UDF was banned, and I could hear the tamboya, boya, hoya, boya going past. And I was torn out of the university, and I joined the struggle at that time. And I kind of managed to balance the struggle and university, and I was studying law. Some people said, no, but we're going to need to know how to handle the economy. Why don't you do economics? So really, that was it. I spent time, I was on the SRC at Wits, and I think I was at Wits for many years. I studied economics and law. That was my balance.
Okay. You obviously saw the transition of political from before and after 94, where we saw political power change, but we didn't necessarily see economic power change. Can you walk us through why that is and basically what's happened?
Yeah, that's a very important $1 million question. Because we did decisively see political power change. I saw it with my own eyes. It was a very different country before 1994 and Mandela becoming president and the ANC government taking power. But we've been very disappointed, I would say, that the economy hasn't changed in the same way, in the same revolutionary way that we might have seen political change. And then you ask, why is that? I'm not one who blames the Constitution or the negotiations. I think that the potential was there, and the Constitution, in fact, mandates us to do more to change our society. Socioeconomic rights, democracy, all of those things, they're mandated. So then the question is, if it's not, because some people do argue that's why we held back. I don't think so. I think based on that platform of the Constitution, the rule of law, we could have done more to improve our economic performance. There are times when we did have growth, we did have employment during that period. There was a post-apartheid dividend, investment rates were rising, there was some job creation, but it was never really bold enough. There was never really a bold change to the the economic power relations in the society. There wasn't really a strong redistribution program. There maybe wasn't enough investment in housing, in infrastructure to really change people's lives. But when things really went off the rails, because the debate was still about how do we do this, I think the state became repurposed and became very weak and wasn't able to lead that program of bold economic transformation. Particularly in this period of state capture, corruption, it really weakened what our state was capable of doing. And I think that I would say that those were the real factors, the weakening of state capacity, the repurposing where people were enriching themselves rather than a program to enrich ordinary people and to redistribute wealth, redistribute income, redistribute opportunity through service delivery. If your education system is running, your health system is running properly, if you're extending services to people who haven't had them before, that changes people's lives, their capabilities, their capacities. And when you start redirecting resources to personal pockets and away from those objectives, you're going to weaken your state. And when you weaken your state, you're going to weaken your economic performance.
I guess the result of that has been the challenge that we do have of unemployment, inequality, and poverty. Okay, let's start with unemployment. What, from a government perspective, could be done to impact the economic aspect, which speaks to jobs.
I always think of this fact when I teach my students, when I'm thinking about what can be done. Because sometimes they call economics the dismal science. It's dismal. It always tells you what you can't do, not what you can do.
But let's start with that. Economics.
Yeah. Economics is about understanding, at least macroeconomics is about understanding the relationship between policy and practice and outcomes in a theoretical way and testing those relationships empirically. And I teach my students, in early 1960s, the GDP per capita in a country like Ghana was slightly better than, or more or less the same as, the GDP per capita in a country like South Korea. They were the same. Then with good economic policy, you can see that over the decades from the 1960s to today, those 50, 60 years, the GDP per capita in South Korea is now more than 10 times higher than the GDP per capita in Ghana. Now, what is GDP per capita? Well, that's the product of the country, total product divided by the number of people in the country. So it's a good way of comparing countries. So if one country has got 10 times bigger than the other in terms of the well-being of its people, the product that each person has on average is 10 times higher, then you've got to say to yourself, well, what has been done in terms of economic policy in one country that has lifted people out of poverty and another country which hasn't lifted people out of poverty? What has been done differently? Similar story with China in the 1980s, late 70s and 80s, through the pragmatic economic policies of a leader like Deng Xiaoping, you lift millions, hundreds of millions of people from living hand-to-mouth subsistence to being a superpower with great technical capabilities, great export capabilities, etc., etc. So if you do economic policy correctly, you can change people's lives. It's not dismal, and it's not only about saying what we can't do. It can signal that things can improve with regard to unemployment, with regard to poverty, with regard to inequality in a society. So sometimes we talk about growth, and sometimes we talk about redistribution. And I believe that you need to have both a framework that allows for both growth and redistribution in a reinforcing way to happen. Because you can't follow a policy that is merely redistributive, because there isn't enough to go around. And you can't follow one which is just growth, because it won't bring people along with it. So you need a capable state like the Korean state, the Asian states, to say, well, this is our program, this is our industrial program, and this is how we're going to lift people through growth, inclusive growth, through redistribution and growth to higher levels of employment. And so what are the kind of things that a capable state could do in South Africa? And what would we do? So land redistribution. Our land redistribution program is very thoroughly disappointing. The state, there's political power, there's ability to do it. And you say, well, when we do it, let's link that land redistribution to ensure that people are able to produce food for themselves, or even think bigger, to think about production for the cities, production for exports. You can lift people if they have that support to get land redistribution going, just as an example. Yet we get waylaid by debates around expropriation without compensation, and that becomes the debate for 10 years, but we're not doing the land redistribution. It becomes the sloganeering around, populist sloganeering has helped to lose our focus on what really needs to be done. Because you win that debate, and then what? Then you still have to do the land redistribution linked to production, the ability to produce. What about other things? The just energy transition. We talk about it, and if we could structure our change from being a coal-based, carbon-based economy to one which is, we have a comparative advantage with wind, with solar as well, and we lead that transition in a decisive way, and we say this is where we're moving, we can link industry to that. You can be back. There's upstream, there's downstream linkages, and that's how the Asians did it. They had industrial policy, and you look at your linkages. So if you're building, if you have a vision for this new growth model based on a low carbon, secure energy supply, then you know what you're going to be producing, not just the solar panels, the wind turbines, and then downstream, all of that comes from that, new types of industry, new types of electric vehicles, hydrogen economy. That's your vision, that's your growth model. But we get caught up in a situation where we over-politic in politics, how are we going to do things? And we end up not actually advancing, and we're paralyzing the capable state. What is it? I think somebody called it a paralysis of analysis. We get stuck in the paralysis of analysis, and we're actually not doing what the capable state needs to be doing.
From an unemployment aspect, right? There's always the chats that, okay, government is responsible for employment, but on the other side, they also say government is bloated. And then they say businesses are supposed to create jobs. I think with regards to developed states, the majority of the jobs do come from SMMEs, etc. So how do we link what government is supposed to do that impacts companies and the economy essentially to create those jobs?
The state has got a very key role to play in creating an environment in which jobs can be created. So yes, it does create some direct jobs. It's the biggest employer in the country. I think there's more than 1 million people, maybe nearly 2 million people who work for the government, and they must be looked after and must be well managed. But to get to the other 16 million people who are not employed, it won't all be employed by the state. The state needs to create an environment in which there's jobs being created by people themselves. By companies themselves. So you have an environment in which you have sufficient electricity. You have an environment in which you have safety and security. You have an environment in which the ports and the rail systems are working. You have that environment, and people want to make money, people want to invest, people want to survive. So it's a combination, it's a mixed economy. The state will play a direct role in employing people, but it also has to create an environment. It has a responsibility to create an environment in which you can let freedom reign. You can let the economy reign. People can participate and invest. Our investment rates are way down now, since COVID, since state capture. Previously, it was touching on 25% of the GDP was being reinvested in our economy every year. So that's investing in the future. Now we're down to about 15, 16%. That's not enough to create jobs.
Foreign, or is it local investment?
Combination of government, a public sector like Eskom and Transnet, and private sector and foreign investment has gone from about 25% down to about 15, 16%. So we're not investing in our future. If you don't invest in your future, you can see the decay around us, the infrastructural decay. If you're not investing in that, you will not create the jobs. We've got a structural, we've got this apartheid colonial structure that can only be overcome through the concerted actions of a capable state that leads the private sector in a certain direction, as has been done in the Asian countries.
Touching to inequality, bringing it there. And you mentioned the GDP per capita. One, how is inequality itself calculated, and how do we land up being the most unequal society?
Okay, so how is it calculated? There's a very famous measure called the Gini coefficient, Gini, Gini coefficient. And it's a technical measure that looks at the degree of inequality in any society. So if you've got a very high degree of inequality, meaning that lots of people have got very little and very few people have got a lot, then your Gini coefficient is extremely high. It gets close to 1. If you've got very little inequality, meaning that almost everyone, like the poorest 20% have got like 18% and the richest 20% have got 22% of the wealth, then your Gini coefficient will be close to 0 in that case. So South Africa's Gini coefficient means we've got a high degree of inequality. The poorest have got many and have got very little, and the richest are few and have got a lot. So, and how did we get here? Well, it's the history of this country. In particular, we can talk about land dispossession, can talk about the apartheid education system. We can talk about black people not being allowed to own businesses or to do certain professions. There's a long, deep colonial apartheid history which casts a long shadow and leaves that shadow of inequality. But in the last 30 years, that's true, we have that history. It goes back to my point around the state having not led the society on a bolder path of economic reform.
Yeah, I assume from a fiscal part it would be tax. But what else? Something like a land redistribution. But what else, or how could one use those practically to actually touch or tackle the issue of inequality?
Okay, so economists talk about redistribution and pre-distribution. Okay, so redistribution is what you're talking about, like tax. So if the high income earners, and some of the people in this country earn a lot of income, you then tax them at a much higher rate, 45% maybe, and you use that, you redistribute the income through the state. And studies have shown that our state is highly redistributive. It's highly redistributive. The problem is you have to grow and redistribute. So we're highly redistributive, but we're not growing. So then you're not getting to everybody. It's a structural flaw. We're not getting to everybody. So that's redistribution, as you say, and land redistribution. Like, why have so few people in a particular area got ownership of land, there's state land, there's private land that should be made available to people through processes that don't destroy the agricultural system, but grow the agricultural system. That would be my grow and redistribute together. That has to be. Then what is pre-distribution? When you talk about that, that is about, for example, what capabilities are people given before they even enter the market? So what is the state's role in ensuring a fairer, you can think of it as fairer access to opportunities? Like the state of our public health system, the state of our public education system is very unequal. There's some really good schools, some really bad schools. So through providing proper access to opportunity and looking at it through that lens, when people enter the market, they are able to actually get better outcomes.
So something like BE or NHI are things that would speak to what you're saying?
They would.
One of your lectures, you indicated with regards to tax, almost the less you tax, the more incentive there is for a business, for an individual to go entrepreneurial and incentive. How do we balance that part in terms of growing or incentivizing people to go out and make money versus managing the element of redistribution?
Yeah, so this is like deeper economics. It's about balancing. It's about balancing things. Because if I tax everybody at 100%, it makes a lot of sense because I'm going to get maximum out of them on day one. But what's going to happen on day two? On day two, people are going to be disincentivized to work because the government's taking 100%. So you have to balance this. You've got to say, well, I want to get the maximum out of these people for the long term. So I must go, okay, well, 45% for these well-off guys and then 20% and others for lower tax rates. And if you're only earning 5,000 a month, then we're not going to tax you. Okay. So you've got to balance these things, So something that sounds really radical and this is going to be good, 100%, it will work for only one day. And we have to balance things to be able to sustain them over time.
Would you say that our system as is one that's sufficient? It's just the other issues we should work on.
I would say that the studies show that our state is very redistributive. So in the sense that our income tax is highly redistributive. Some have argued that we should tax the high income earners a little bit more. And there might be scope for that. Instead of 45%, make it 50% at the margin. But there's limits. At some point, you're going to create major disincentives. And people also tend to change the way they get paid then. So then they'll have fringe benefits. I'll get paid with a car, I'll get paid with that. And they reduce their income. They get paid with, for example, the big banks in this country. They earn very high salaries, the CEOs. But a lot of it is not income per se. It's like it's other forms of payment, such as linked to the share price of the company and options and things like that. So there's limits to, we're at the limits, more or less, of how redistributive we can be on income. Others would argue, well, the state should focus now on facilitating growth. Because if you grow the economy, then the state will have more revenue. Because let's say it taxes businesses. Now, this is different tax, not the personal income tax, but business profit tax. If it taxes at the moment around 27, 28%, and the businesses are growing, then they are profitable, then there'll be more for the state. So there's a strong relationship in macroeconomics between economic growth rates and tax revenues. And there's also a negative one. When the economy goes into recession or into low growth, then the state has less revenue and its budget deficit rises. So these are all the relationships that you see, that there's a link between the growth of the economy and the strength of the state. If the economy is growing, the state will have more strength, more fiscal strength.
In news talk generally, there's always this thing of inflation, interest rates, exchange currency, whether it's strong or weak. Can you make that palatable for us? So what's the link? Where does it start? Where does it end?
I'm here to make things palatable for you. So let me try and do that. There was an interesting story in the United Kingdom last year. I don't know if you saw it. The finance minister stood up and said, my plan is to cut the taxes for the rich. Okay. And the government, him and the prime minister were both out of a job within 50 days. Because let's understand the consequence of what he did. It was a populist thing for the rich. Okay, rich populism, a different kind of thing to say, well, we're gonna cut the taxes for the rich, but he never had a plan for how to replace that lost money. So what he was essentially saying is that we're going to make the government poorer. We're going to reduce the tax we're taking in. We're going to carry on spending the same amount. So we're going to increase the deficit. So let's get this straight. You're going to cut the taxes, so you're going to have less revenue. Therefore, you're going to have a bigger deficit on the budget. Once you've got a bigger deficit, then the government has to borrow more. Once the government has to borrow more, the interest rates will rise. Because if you're borrowing more, the interest rates, the demand for borrowing is rising. The price of borrowing is interest rates, and interest rates will rise. So because of this decision that was everyone perceives to be a wrong decision, you had the Minister of Finance, Kwateng was his name, Kwasi Kwateng, saying we're going to cut the taxes. You have rising interest rates, rising cost of living for the ordinary citizen. So the ordinary citizen is saying, but you cut the taxes on the rich, you have no plan to fill the gap in your budget. Now the interest rates are rising. Now if I'm paying a mortgage on my bond at home, I have to pay more because of your wrong decision. So macroeconomics is about the linkages, the cause and effect, the linkages between things. So when something happens in the economy, if the government makes a wrong decision, it can impact very directly on ordinary people. If government makes a right decision, it can impact very directly on ordinary people. So that's why I'm quite concerned about, the populism, etc., the populist sloganeering that happens, because it can attract people who think, well, yeah, let's do that. But what about that causal chain of economics? That iron law, okay, if we do this, then this is going to happen, this is going to happen. You can't ignore that. You can't just say, yes, for example, if we had a referendum, let's pay no more tax. Maybe everyone's going to vote, yeah, no more tax. This is the way to go. But what's the consequence of that? As we said, that the government is the biggest employer in the country. It won't be able to pay its salaries. Or if it has to pay its salaries, it's going to have to borrow more money because there's no tax. Because government's money comes from tax and from borrowing. Whatever it can't tax, it borrows. So no more tax. I mean, I could have won the election on 29 May with my party that said we'll have a referendum on whether we have tax, because then, it's a populist slogan. It's a good idea. But it's not practical. Economically, that's why it's important that people study economics and have an understanding of, it is a science or a set of relationships, set of causal relationships. If we do X, then Y will happen. If Y happens, Z will happen. And if Z happens, we're going to be worse off.
Okay. So currently, at the time of this interview, there's a bit of uncertainty as to who the next president is going to be. So there's Ramaphosa and T. Ramaphosa, and the say scenario of it's not him, and it goes to about 20 rand to $1. What does this mean for the person, for me, for you, on a day-to-day, explaining it via the interest, inflation, etc.?
Yeah, I was a young student. I studied in I finished high school in 87. Then I went through university in about 96. I was finished. Then I went on holiday to Thailand in about 1997 and to the Philippines. And there was the Asian crisis while I was there. And I was standing in the streets and I was just standing with all the other Thai people looking at the screens. And the currency, the baht, was moving like this from like 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, because it was devaluing. And you're saying, well, what would happen if there's a strong devaluation of the currency? Well, what would happen immediately is that you would see the rand getting weaker. So you're saying it's 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. If that was to, why would that happen? Because it's about forces of supply and demand. So if there is a lot of demand for the rand, then the rand will get stronger. It'll go 18, 17, 16. If there's if there's no demand for the rand, people are getting out of the rand. The supply is greater than the demand, then the price is just going to go, it's going to go 18, 19, 20, 21 because people don't want that currency. And the rand is a global currency. It's on the global markets. You can buy it in Japan. You can buy it in New York. It's there. It's on the markets. So if the sentiment turns, it turns very quickly. And you'll be like a Thai person in the street watching it move, okay? Then the next step is then we'll have inflation because our economy is an open economy. We import oil. We import fuel. We import petrol. We don't make any petrol. So immediately the petrol price will go up. Well, maybe not immediately, within a few weeks, because we have it set by the government. Yeah. They'll announce, unfortunately, the rand is now 25 to the dollar. The petrol price is going up by 3 rand. And if it continues, it goes. Now, once the petrol price goes up, then the food price will go up because food gets driven around in trucks, and the diesel price goes up. So it's a causal chain of what would happen. So you say we will find out in a few days' time what's going to happen politically. It's the right question to ask because I think that the key challenge of this moment, for the first time ever, the ANC has not got over 50%. It's working with around 40% of the support. The question is, can a government be formed, a viable government be formed, that is able to drive through sensible economic policy? That is the key question. Whoever's the leader, we'll see. But can it continue to drive through sensible economic policy? What is for me sensible economic policy? Capable state, not corrupt, growth and redistribution, which is really going to help people. So can we have a state that will be able to do that? There's forces on the right that are against that. They're concerned about redistribution and affirmative action and change and all the things that have to be done. Land, all the things that they're against. There's forces on the left that are, I think, populist forces that are not giving us a sustainable economic model either. They're saying, do X, they're forgetting what will happen the next day. So it's a real moment. I mean, 30 years on, we've never been in this moment because ANC has been quite sensible in the way it's run economic policy at a macro level, but has failed to really deliver a lot of what it needed to deliver. Now we've got a chance to change things, but you want to change things in the right direction, where you have this growth and redistribution model that the state is able to be capable and not corrupt and isn't pulled to the left or the right. The time will tell whether this is going to happen.
With regards to, okay, fine, you said exchange rate goes up, petrol goes up, food prices goes up, which leads to inflation going up. And then the interest rate, what happens there?
Interest rates have to go up because interest rates, when inflation rises, the interest rates have to go up. Because if they don't, let's say if you're lucky enough to have 10,000 Rand in the bank, okay, as your savings. And it's a lot of money, I know, but let's say you've got 10,000 Rand in the bank, hypothetically, okay? If there's inflation, that 10,000 Rand is becoming worthless to you. Well, not worthless, but it's becoming worth 9,000, worth 8,000 in terms of what you can buy with the 10,000. So the only way to protect the money in the bank is to have interest rates that are at least equal to inflation. So if the inflation is 5%, then you want an interest rate of 5%. Otherwise, your financial system will go into collapse. It'll become eaten up by the inflation. So there's a strong link between inflation and interest rates. When interest rates go up, inflation goes up. And there's another link I can tell you as well. They talk about coordinating monetary and fiscal policy. Yeah. So fiscal policy, this is the thing about the populist economics. If you promise things that your fiscus cannot afford, okay, if you say we're going to do X, Y, Z, and you can't afford it, then you're going to have a situation where you're going to have to be borrowing more. And when you're borrowing more, you will also push up the interest rates. So the fiscal policy, if it's if it's unsustainable, will also in the same way will lead to higher interest rates. And if you try and hold the interest rates down while you're doing that, you're going to have inflation and you're going to have high interest rates. And if you try and continue to do that, you will find that people will not invest in this. You'll have a weak exchange rate. And ultimately, if you're not able to pay that debt, that unsustainable debt, this is the real danger. I remember Thabo Mbeki warned us many years ago in those debates around gear, etc., etc. Like, if you do things that are populist for too long, you will lose control over your own economic policy because you'll have to start borrowing hard currency. Because like Zimbabwe, your currency loses its meaning. So you have to start dealing in foreign currency. And when you start doing that, you lose control of your policy because those people that are going to give you access to hard currency will come with conditions.
Having a weaker currency, I mean, we've seen a number of currencies, whether it's China, etc., devaluating their currency to push exports. Is there no positive side to having a 25 Rand a dollar?
Yeah. So I spoke about a crisis moment where there's a change in sentiment and you're sitting in Thailand and you're watching the currency move. There's a crisis. What you're asking is not about a crisis. Yours is about a policy lever. Can we use the exchange rate? We in control. It's not like we're out of control. It's not a crisis. Can we use the exchange rate policy to try to make ourselves more competitive? And yes, you rightly say, but it's a very distinct situation, okay? It's not a crisis. It's now we are a developmental state, we're capable, and we're debating, should we weaken our exchange rate somewhat in order to boost our exports? There's merit in that. But you're in control. It's a different thing from being out of control. There's merit in that. For example, it was part of the Asian model was an export-driven China. It became a workshop for the world. It was an export-driven Korea. And you help to boost your exports by being cheaper, and you're cheaper if your currency is weaker, and you hold it like that. But South Africa, there's another side to that. We also are importing materials that we need to become, to industrialize. So machinery, and I spoke about oil earlier. So we're making it more expensive in order to, so those inputs, the machinery, the technology, and the oil and the petrol, those inputs that we need to be competitive will become more expensive if we weaken the currency. So what is it? It's a balancing act. You've got to know what you're doing. It's a balancing act. You never want to be out of control where it's just you're in a crisis. You don't want to do stuff that will precipitate a crisis. Then you can have a sensible discussion as to where is the balance. Should we weaken the currency a little bit or should we not?
It's like swimming in a pool versus swimming in a tide.
It's exactly, yeah. It's fine if you're in a pool, but when the tide is out, you're not going to be able to fight it.
Okay. Now, I mean, we've mentioned ANC under 40% has to work with different parties, whether it's government or national unity. What does it mean now when you have a party with left beliefs working with a party with right beliefs?
That's a difficult one. I think that you can't mix oil and water very easily, So there's going to be, you're going to look down at the GNU and you're going to see puddles of oil and water trying to coalesce in that sense. There are major ideological differences in this country as there are all over the world. The world is, ideology is coming alive. Identity politics is coming alive. It's not just in South Africa, whether you're in India or in America or in Germany. These countries have got serious ideological contestation around identity, around ideology that we haven't really seen before. Like there were some clever guys who spoke about the end of history and that kind of liberal Western ideology had won and it was homogenous and now we're just going to get richer and progress and globalize and integrate and we'll all become one human species rather than having our own identities. It felt like that, but it's not what's happening. Things have taken a turn. And South Africa is not immune from any of that. So that's why I come back to what I'm saying, that if we're going to build a government of national unity or some kind of governing coalition, it needs to have it needs to coalesce around certain practical principles of how we can have growth and redistribution. Those, maybe in the DA who don't want redistribution, have to come to terms with the reality of this country. Those who don't want growth on the popular side need to come to terms that you can't have redistribution without growth. And there needs to be a center that holds.
Thank you. Thank you for making time for us, making things palatable. For your guys' benefits, in the bio we'll include links to some of his works, whether it's written work or some of the lectures you've had on YouTube. But thank you for making time for us. Any sensible or economic advice you'd like to give to our viewers, whether personal, political?
Thanks, Tapelo, for this wonderful opportunity. I've really enjoyed talking to you. You asked me some really tough questions. I hope that I've given you palatable answers.
Definitely.
I don't have much advice to dispense. I'm still trying to work it out for myself. But I do believe in economics. And I do believe that economics must be part of our tools of analysis as we do our statecraft, as we build our country. We need to have that sensible economic understanding of how things relate to each other so that we actually do build in a sustainable way for everybody.
But on that, I'm going to abuse this platform to request at a later point we'll have an economic lecture, about the economic history, whether from the gold standard to deregulation or left or right, etc., different ideologies, capitalism, etc.
I would welcome that. Thank you.
Guys, you heard it. We'll let you know when that's out. But thank you for tuning in. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, share, comment. Let us know what else you'd like to know about. Same place, same time next week.